Dr. Mirelman has come to Milwaukee a number of times. He's given presentations on Jews of Spain, and today he's going to focus on Jews of Argentina. He's come to town thanks to the Milwaukee Jewish Museum, Milwaukee Museum. I'm not sure of the
Museum of Milwaukee.
Jewish Museum Milwaukee, which has just recently opened up an exhibition on the Jews of Argentina, and that'll be there through the end of the year. And so, if anybody here, I hope everybody will get a chance to go there and see it. But tonight, he's also going to be speaking at the museum from 7 to 9. It's right on Prospect, very near here, and so if you're interested and able, please join him as well. But he was very gracious to also offer to come and speak to us here at UWM. So thank you very much for coming.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Kathy, and bienvenidos. Though you are the hosts, I'm the one who's an outsider. But it's nice to see all of you. The topic of Argentinian Jewry has been my subject of research and publications for a long time. And I did basic original spadework research on the early part of Argentinian Jewry at the end of the 19th century up to the big dividing year of 1930. But of course, I've written on the periods, some especially difficult processes in later periods as well, including Jews during the proceso, the last junta, which was the most cruel of all the juntas in Argentinian history, from 1976 up to 1983. With the disappearances, which is a euphemism for killings, terrorizing, and so on. So the issue is, and there are multiple issues, but if you all know what I'm talking about, just tell me and I'll talk about something else. But I don't know if you're aware of the basic issues in Argentinian history. Have you studied? Some of you did, some not. The main question I want to address to start for the kickoff is why so many Jews went to Argentina when you look at the map, it's at the end of the continent. If you're coming from Europe, you might have gone to Recife in Brazil, which was actually the place where the first Jewish immigrants appeared, which is the closest point in the Americas to Europe and Africa, or even the northern parts. It's closer. Why did so many go to Argentina as compared to the rest of the continent? More than half of all the Latin American Jews were in Argentina. And the answer is for a variety of reasons. The first reason, I would say, is that Argentina, at the time of mass emigration of Jews from Europe, was in a process of welcoming immigrants. It had other countries, each country had a different policy. Some countries did not want European immigration. They wanted to preserve the families in power, wanted to preserve that power, the so-called white ones, as compared to the others. And Argentina, and to a certain point Uruguay and Chile, had a policy of gobernar es poblar. That was the motto of Juan Bautista Alberdi, already in the 1860s and so on. To govern means to bring immigrants to the country. It was based on a positivist philosophy, which went counter to many of the tenets of the Catholic Church. But basically it said the country is a rich country. We have the huge pampas. We can produce a lot of food for the whole world, but we need people to collect, to harvest the crops. And you have to bring immigrants. And the best source of immigrants is Europe. And the best source in Europe are immigrants from the northern countries. They thought Germans, English, and so on. Not so much the South, Spanish and Italian, or the Eastern, the Russians and the Jews in Eastern Europe. But as you all know, and this I think it's a fact that everybody has come across it, who came from Europe? The two main currents were the Spaniards and the Italians. Actually, more Italians than Spanish people came to Argentina. And some of them would come and go. Inmigración golondrina, the swallow immigration. They would come for the summer months in the southern hemisphere, collect the harvest, fill their pockets with some money, and then go back home, to Italy especially, and work the summer season there. And they would do it every year. So that was one thing. Another important point was the famous law called Ley Avellaneda. Avellaneda was the president of Argentina in the 1870s, and in 1876 there was a law of immigration to encourage immigration, to give all types of facilities for the new immigrants. They built the Hotel de Inmigrantes in Buenos Aires on the port. Today they have reconstructed it in the old-fashioned way. It's a huge museum to immigration. So mutatis mutandis, the Ellis Island of Argentina. It was a port of entry, and the immigrants would be allowed to stay a period of 3 to 5 days with meals. The accommodations were not 5-star hotels, but it was some type of welcoming to the new immigrants. And then they would move to the interior of the country or stay in the big city and so on. So this is 1876. The further factor was what is called in Spanish la generación del 80. In Argentine history, the generation of that decade, of the 1880s, was what I would call the generation of the great founding fathers in the U.S. A lot of very important thinkers and doers involved in bringing the country up to date in several aspects. One was the separation of church and state in an effective way. So they created, in the early parts of the decade, in 1881, the Ley de Registro Civil. They established a civil registry where people would register the births and the deaths and the weddings. No bar mitzvahs yet. And why was this important? Because up to then, all these things were registered at the parishes. So each district had a parish, la parroquia of this barrio, la parroquia of that barrio. So everything was in the hands of the Catholic Church. These people were Catholics themselves, but all these positivist ideas and the desire to bring the country out of its doldrums and impel it into a more diversified economy motivated them. That was in 1884. They created the law of matrimonio civil, of civil marriage. So in Argentina, if you wanted to get married, it wasn't enough to go to the priest. You first had to go to the justice of the peace and get married. Up to this day. In
Some other countries too. Peru is that way too.
Yeah, well, after that, in many other countries. Today, I'm a rabbi as well, so when I did a wedding here, I had the authority not only as a rabbi to perform a wedding, but I was empowered by the township to perform. So I filled out the secular form as well and sent it in. But in Argentina, you had to do it before the religious ceremony. So people, when they got engaged, or the parents were planning a wedding, oh, you have to do the civil and then you have to go do the religious. 2 separate dates. It's a whole way of life. But again, that's very important because some people just wanted a civil marriage. And, you know, finito, la commedia è finita. They didn't want a religious wedding. Or it facilitated intermarriages and all types of corollaries to that. And finally, and I would say just as important, even if more important, was the Ley de Educación, a new law regarding education in 1884. And to put it in a nutshell, education was now universal. Means everybody had the obligation up to a certain amount of years to get an education, but also the right to that education. The education was free and secular. Big step from the point of view of the Jews in Europe trying to escape the pogroms in Russia at the same time. No? So if you wanted to operate a government, a public school in Buenos Aires or anywhere in the country, you could not meet in the premises of a church. Absolutely. Not even after hours, after the Mass or what have you. You could not, by dictum. So, of course, all these things were debated in both chambers in the country, and hotly debated, because those on the side of the church wanted to protect their turf and so on. Clashes for years, but they prevailed. And this was a major step that facilitated the immigration of non-Catholics. By the end of the century, the Argentine economy was not fully developed like in the U.S. or you know, on its way to become a world power. But in a way, it was slightly behind the United States, but ahead of all the other economies in the continent. It was a country that people felt had a future. It was in the minds and hearts of the people there. There was a very entrepreneurial society, and the country was going to build wealth and attract other people to its shores. Also, and this is an aside, there were the famous Argentinian hacendados, you know, people whose parents or grandparents received huge amounts of land, and they were already exploiting them, and they had become the very wealthy Argentinians who would travel to Europe for 4 months or 5 months in carrying their own cows so they would have fresh milk and so on. You know, all these stories that people saw, you know, you're rich as an Argentinian in Europe, they would say. In those days, in La Belle Époque, in Paris and London and so on. So there were a few of those. Not everybody was wealthy and rich, but the country had a lot to offer. My father and his older brothers came to Argentina. The older brother came in 1910 or 12, and then thought he would go back to the U.S. He had come from Europe to the U.S. and through an uncle who urged him to come to Argentina because here you can really fare l'America. You know, the Italians would say make America. So make it in America, in the continent. And said, I'll try it for a year, but you will have to send me a return ticket. Sure enough, he went, and then the war broke out, First World War, and he stayed there. Very easily, he made up his way, got married, started very entrepreneurial. After the war, all the other brothers came. There were 5 males and 3 females. My father was the 8th in line. But reminiscing, my father would tell me decades later, it was an easy country. Well, they were lucky they made it. Others didn't, you know, but a lot of people made it in America, in Argentina. So those are the basic factors. In the 1880s, the pogroms start in Russia. 1881, right at the beginning of the spring, the first pogroms start against the Jews, and they spread like fire all over Eastern Europe. And Jews are moving out, and we're now talking about huge numbers of Jews, millions. Not everybody moved at the same time, but looking for places to go. A few would go to Palestine, which was part of the Ottoman Empire at the time, others to Western Europe. A lot wanted to go all the way to America. And in the minds of a lot of them, America was just one big chunk of land on the other side of the Atlantic. And some heard of Argentina. Argentina had slowly started to advertise its immigration policy in the newspapers in Russia. Actually, during the administration of Julio Roca in the early 80s, as the pogroms started in Russia, he appointed an Argentinian consul in Russia to attract immigration. We're talking 1881. So the backlash in the newspapers in Argentina was very negative. What are you trying to do? You know, you feel the anti-Semitism already. And but anyway, it continued. A lot of Jews went elsewhere at the time. But it took another entrepreneurial movement headed by Baron Moritz the Hirsch to give some impulse to migrations to Argentina. This Baron the Hirsch was a native of Munich, became a maverick businessman. He was in banking, in investments, and especially one of the leading investors in railroads in the decades right before, when it all started. So he amassed a fortune compared to the Rothschilds, but he was one person. And he was married to Clara Bischofsheim. And the Bischofsheims were extremely wealthy bankers in Brussels. So there was a merger more than a marriage. Lots of money. And they had 2 children, and eventually they lost both children. And this Baron Hirsch was involved in many, many charitable activities. In general, in Europe, he was a man without frontiers. You know, He was so wealthy, he had homes in London and in Paris and hunting places in Hungary, what have you. But very charitable man. And once he had no more heirs, he said, humanity will be my heir. And in those days, while the pogroms in Russia were taking place, the official policy of the czars and their advisors was to build a Russia that was that would adhere to the principles of the Russian nationality, to the Orthodox Church, and liquidate all the minorities as much as possible. With the Jews, the policy was divided in three. A third will emigrate, a third will remain, and a third will be killed. This was one of the great ministers, advisors of the Tsar in those days. Also, the sentiment against the Jews was not only along religious lines, accused of deicides, of killing the Christian God and so on, but also in along economic lines, even by the incipient socialist thinkers of those days in Europe, in France and in Germany and so on. They would accuse the Jews of being parasites. They are speculators. They invest, but they don't create wealth. That was one of the major accusations. We don't need these parasites. Baron Hirsch would try to prove the opposite, that the Jews could be and were people who produced wealth. After all, you look at the Bible, the book of Genesis and other books, the Jews were farmers, they were involved in agriculture and so on. They produced wealth. But once they were dispersed, they were more in business. And buying and selling is not producing wealth, according to this very, very partial view of the world. Because everybody knows that producing items is not the only factor in getting these items to the users. You need transportation, you need distribution, you need retailers. So everything is part of the process. Otherwise, the produce would be in the farmer's silo, and nobody would buy it. But anyway, Baron Hirsch first tried to invest money by giving money to the czars and let them work with the Jewish communities and see if they could bring them to become agriculturists. But he soon realized that by giving his millions to the czars, they were doing nothing with it. They were just pocketing it. So he decided to invest in places where the Jews could go back to the land. And he sent emissaries. We're talking now in the middle of the 1880s, the same period. And he sent people to Canada and to the US, to Australia, and to South America. And one of them, Mr. Lowenthal, or Dr. Lowenthal, wrote back from Argentina. There are the Pampas, and there's an economic downturn, so you can buy land at a cheaper rate, etc., etc. So the Baron Hirsch embarked in that project of buying land and advertised that he would help immigrants from Russia to Argentina. And that's how the Jewish Colonization Association started. Now, I don't want to take all the time to just describe this process, but it is a different development that you find in Argentina, and you don't find them that at that large extent in any other country in the world. A few in Brazil, but Quatro Irmãos and a couple of other farms. But in Argentina, it was widespread over 6 or 7 of the provinces, especially in Santa Fe and Entre Rios provinces, but also in La Pampa and the province of Buenos Aires, even in El Chaco, which is close to the Paraguayan border. There were colonies of Jews involved in farmland and in raising stock, livestock, and they eventually were very profitable. Now, the bulk of the Jews did not go to the farms. Those are the Jewish gauchos. It's especially picturesque aspect of Argentine Jewry, that a lot of families have roots in these colonies. And they founded synagogues there and libraries and schools for their children, both along the Argentinian curriculum plus Jewish studies. And it was a very rich Jewish life plus a very rich Argentinian life as well. And there are vignettes of those early days in a book written by a young man who was born in Russia but raised both in Moisesville in the province of Santa Fe and later on in Entre Rios. And this person was Alberto Gershunov. Those who study literature might have heard the name. He's a classic. He started to write vignettes of Jewish life in these colonies in the 1900s, just in the years preceding the centennial of Argentine independence in 1910, or the revolution of 1810, the centennial. And these were gathered in a book which was called Los Gauchos Judíos. And there are vignettes of life. His own father, and he tells it in a story, was assassinated by a gaucho. And those who understand the language, I think almost all of you, el gaucho malevo, some of them were very, very prone to start duels and fight with their knives against each other. And one killed his father. That's why they moved from one province to a different province, but all within the scope of these agricultural projects. So the name of Argentina became known in the press, especially the Jewish press in Europe, in England, in France, and especially in Russia and Germany. And there were agents that were recruiting people to go to the farms. So the name of Argentina was heard in the Jewish world, in the old world. And that was another factor that attracted. So you have the policies of the country, the economy that was a very hopeful economy. Unfortunately, a lot of people kept saying Argentina has a great future. And it's always the next thing. But in any case, Argentina became a very important country. But it also has the other side. And the other side is equally important. That's why my talks are usually entitled Argentine Jews, Attainments and Tribulations, or inclusion or exclusion. And we find that quite a bit throughout a history now which is about almost a century and a half. As I mentioned earlier, up to 1930, the governments of Argentina succeeded each other in a very democratic way. There were skirmishes, revolts, but nobody was actually deposed until 1930. So for a period of 70 years since the unification around 1860, before the, it was a period of turmoil with the caudillos. But after 1860, as the republic is organized, for 70 years there are no revolts. Even when they changed the laws, the electoral laws, because in the old days it was voto cantado. People went and voted calling the name of their candidate. There was no ballot. So everybody was there with empanadas and wine, and you vote for me, and whatever. Not that they don't do that today in a different fashion, but and then eventually the radicales got into power. Radicales were the centrist party. Before it was the so-called benevolent oligarchy. The well-to-do families were in power, and they were paternalistic. They had good intentions for everybody, but especially for themselves. Then the middle class came with Irigoyen, Hipólito Yrigoyen. There are different Irigoyens in the history of the country. And so the middle class party took over, and it was a smooth transition. In 1916, and they won 3 elections, 16, 22, and 28. In those days it was every 6 years. But 2 years later, in 1930, the first military takeover takes place. And as I mentioned, my book ends in 1930. That's a very important date. Not only in Argentina, it's also important in world affairs, the crash in Wall Street, almost the beginnings of totalitarian governments in Italy, and then later on, shortly thereafter, in Germany, and so on. The end of the world of yore takes place. But Argentina would see military revolts in every decade. In the 40s, the young lieutenants, and Perón was one of them. He eventually rises to the presidency. Then he is deposed, in the 40s. So then he's deposed in the 50s, in 1955. Then there is another revolt with Onganía in the 60s. And eventually, in 1976, the last revolt with the most nefarious, the saddest and most cruel period in the history of Argentina, from 76 to 83, the last military junta. So the country is involved in all this. Now, how many Jews came to Argentina? For those who don't know, I will pose you a question. It's not an exam, just to get a grasp. How many Jews do you think live in the whole world? Venture a number.
200,000.
200,000? You mean in Chicago? No, it's a little more.
10 million.
10 million is very close.
12 million.
Yeah, about 13 million, some say 14 million. It's not a huge number. Yeah. It's a very small number. On the eve of World War II, there were 16 million, and 6 were killed. 6 million. And then the Jewish people recouped a little bit. But it's a very small population. About 6 million live in the state of Israel, about 6 million in the US. In some countries in Europe, there are substantial populations, but we have about 2 million in the rest of the world, outside of that includes France and England. Argentina at one point, around 1960, 55 years ago, was at its highest in Jewish population. Almost 500,000. 450, some people say even 500,000. Huge number. How come there were so many there? And of course, why are there only now half that number of Jews? It's not that they all, intermarried or disappeared or what have you. A lot left. Many went to the state of Israel for ideological reasons, and many went to other countries. The reason was, one, because of the insecurity of the military regimes. Secondly, because of economic reasons. They had a better future in other countries where they could get in. A lot came to this country, Canada, Australia, some other countries in Europe, or even during periods of military dictatorship, they went to neighboring Latin American countries, Mexico, Venezuela, what have you. And some returned, but a lot have left, and many professionals. So most left, I would say, or a large segment left during the period of the desaparecidos, 76 to 83. That group came into power after the second Perón era with Juan Perón and then his third wife, Maria Estela or Estelita, who succeeded him. Evita never succeeded, never was president. It was a different time. But 20 years after Evita, Perón regained the presidency under the ticket Perón-Perón. His wife was vice president. So when he died in 74, she took over. Now, she was a danseuse from whom he had met in a bar in Panama, I think. So she didn't have much experience, though he reassured the nation that he taught her about politics and so on. I mean, Perón was a very charismatic person. There are many sides to his personality. And the military that took over, and people would say, when is the golpe? The golpe is the revolt. People knew about the golpe months before it took place in March of 76. So they took over the government, and the motto, again I'm making it very brief, the motto of the government was to restore the civilización occidental y cristiana, to restore the Western and Christian civilization. The people who took over owned the country in their minds. They owned the country, and it had been on loan to these others. And these others were the guerrilla groups, the leftists of all types, Marxists, Leninists, Stalinists, whatever, socialists, all types of pinkos. And there were tens, dozens of different groups, Montoneros and other names, you know, and sometimes they fought against each other. But they all had a socialist concept of society, to help the indigent, to lift the poor, and to put down the wealthy. Now, it's very nice for those who are on the receiving side, but those who are not, it wasn't. And it was part of their religious understanding of what was supposed to be the real identity of the country. You know, a Western civilization based on Christian principles. Now, the Jews are originally from the Middle East, though they came from Russia or they came from the Sephardic countries in the Ottoman Empire. Not all the Jews came from Russia. My mother came from Turkey, the descendant of Spanish Jews who were expelled from Spain. The family name was Toledo. You can't get more Spanish than that. But they had lived in Turkey for 400 some years, and they still spoke medieval Spanish among themselves. But others came from Syria and North Africa, so there was a substantial Sephardic population as well. But according to these military people, this is a country that has to restore its Christian and Western civilization. So the Jews very much felt not belonging there. Now, again, I'm going to give you a second example. If you are a Montonero or a guerrilla fighting the people who own everything, and you want social justice and distribution of the wealth, would you be living in the city or in the farmlands? The city. Very good. Everybody got a pass. Would you be a middle class or working class? Everybody working class? Middle class. Because the middle class has something that not everybody in the working class has, and that is education. Educated, urban middle class. If you try to define a Jew in any country in the world, it's that. Middle class, educated, urban. Or a little suburban sometimes. But basically that is. So in all these organizations, the leftist organizations, there were a substantial number of Jews. Now, Jews were, say, 1 to 2% of the population of the country. By the late 70s, it was close to 1%. And of those who were killed or disappeared, the Jews constituted 10%. And I'm saying it fits in this type of thinking because the Jews were 10% of the urban educated middle class. You go to Buenos Aires, the Jews are not just 1%, they're maybe 5%. And among the educated and involved in the professions and in industry and so on, you find that they may be up to 10%. So in a way, it fits. Now, the junta was not driven by anti-Semitism. This was no Hitler, Perito. In the operations, it was a Nazi type of operation, because it was revealed afterwards that there were concentration camps, there were torture camps, and there were killing camps. It was not only for the Jews or the gypsies like in Nazi Germany, but it was for everybody who was a leftist, or whoever they found in their telephone books, in their agendas, their friends. The police would go in their green Falcons, the Ford Falcons. Everybody knew if it was a green Ford Falcon, it was the secret police going to for a razzia to get the people that they were pursuing. But when they caught Jews, the way they treated them and tortured them was much more violent than the others. So that's the other side of the picture. So there's a lot of attainment. Let me speak now about the good side of life in Argentina. I grew up there. I'm 71 years old, so I was born in 1943, and I grew up. I had a very, very good youth. I went through high school and through the university. Have a degree in mathematics. Those who've been there in the old School of Mathematics of the University of Buenos Aires. Every now and then I felt some anti-Semitism, but I left in 1965, right before the Onganía Revolution. It was a very good period, actually, when I was at the university, because it was in between military regimes. It was a period of great democracy. Eichmann was captured in Argentina in those days, in 1960, right during the week of the celebration of the 150th anniversary of the first revolution of independence. And Abba Eban, who was the Minister of Foreign Relations of the State of Israel, came in the one and only time that an El Al flight went to Buenos Aires. El Al is the Israeli airline, bringing the foreign minister. He thought, I'm a VIP. They send me in our own plane to help celebrate with the Argentinians and a large Jewish community there. Can you imagine? 1960, almost 500,000 Jews in the country. The plane returns without Abba Eban. He had to fly Air France or something else back to Europe and then back to Israel. But Eichmann was in the plane. It was the government of Arturo Frondizi, and son of Italian immigrants. The immigrants were getting up in politics. Democracy. A little left of center, but very good. In his youth, he had fought against the Nazis in Argentina, protected. He was part of the leadership of the committee against racism and anti-Semitism in the 1930s. He had to break relations with the State of Israel because the State of Israel kidnapped and took a person living in Argentina in an improper way. It was the proper thing. The ambassador of Israel, who we knew because his daughters were part of our youth group. And I remember going to the airport in those days when people went to the airport to say goodbye. The old days, and you waved, and the whole family was embracing the leaders of the community and persona non grata and repudiated by the Argent. But in a matter of few months, they patched up their differences. I think there was a recrudescence of anti-Semitism right after that, and I remember that. In 1960. 1961 was the trial of Eichmann in Jerusalem, another recrudescence of anti-Semitism. I didn't feel it in my own flesh, but I could read about it. And finally, in 1962, when Eichmann was executed, it was the only case that the person was executed in Israel. Again. But all these incidents were perceived by the population. And the country, not only the Jewish community, felt that something had to be done to put a stop, because new nationalist groups were rising in the country, and it was quite uncomfortable. They were not killing people. It was not a pogrom, you know. There were other incidents earlier on in history, but it was very, very important to do something. So the Jewish community, and I remember this, I don't remember exactly which month it was, whether June or July of 1962. But the Jewish community made a call to the population, especially to the Jewish merchants and Jewish industrialists, to close their places of work for a half a day on a Wednesday afternoon from noon till the end of the day, to demonstrate against the rising anti-Semitism in the country. And I remember I was downtown. It was like a Sunday afternoon. There was a lot of solidarity of the general population who also closed their places of work in solidarity. So you see, there are some attainments. Other attainments, you know, just to complete a picture, which, just giving you a few vignettes. We don't have, we can take a whole course, but a few vignettes. The Jewish culture that was created by the immigrant waves, Jewish waves of immigration to the country was very, very rich. For a long time, through the 60s till the end of the century, 20th century, Argentina was considered one of the most important, and Buenos Aires especially, places for the publication of works in Yiddish. Yiddish is the language of the Jews of Eastern Europe. It's an old German mixed with Hebrew words and Russian, what Ladino is for the Sephardic Jews. Elie Wiesel, for example, published his first articles in Yiddish in Buenos Aires in the late 50s. He didn't want to write for a whole decade after the Holocaust. And of course, everybody has heard of Elie Wiesel. He won the Nobel Prize, and he was the one who told Reagan not to go to the cemetery in Europe where Nazis are buried alongside American soldiers. Send their sending the wrong message. Reagan went anyway. But the richness of the Yiddish culture in the 1930s and 1940s, there were 3 dailies appearing in Buenos Aires in Yiddish, plus many weeklies and monthlies, and books written in this language, and the Yiddish theater. The Yiddish theater is a modern invention. It began in Romania and then in Russia and Poland. Vignettes of Jewish life, and sometimes they would take classic works, even Shakespeare, translated and improved sometimes in Yiddish, and they would put these plays, and there were 3 or 4 Yiddish theaters operating in Buenos Aires alone every night during the season. They had, of course, the added incentive was that the seasons were opposite to the northern hemisphere, so the great Yiddish actors from New York would come to Argentina for 2-3 months. You know, even Molly Picon and many others of those days. So it was a very effervescent, a very dynamic life in the Jewish neighborhoods of Argentina, especially Buenos Aires. Well, maybe I'll stop now for some questions.
Sure.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
we are almost out of time.
I tried to give you some vignettes, but yeah.
I have 2 questions.
Yeah.
The first is a general one about what were the conditions that gave rise to the very liberal approach of separation of church and state that you talked about at the beginning. And the second question is that my grandparents came from Odessa,
Yeah.
and they were denied entry into the United States.
Yeah.
And they ended up in Argentina because my grandmother, the story was she had been crying, and because her eyes were red, she had pink eye, and so they were rejected, and they were sent to Argentina. And
Which year was
family
this?
story.
Do you
I
know?
have no.
In the 20s or?
No, this was around 1905.
Oh, okay.
They're from Russia.
Yeah.
He had been drafted
Yeah.
into the Tsar's army.
Yeah.
And so the story was that he worked as a gaucho for 2 years until they could get back.
Good.
Because that
Back
first
to
of
the
all, that
States.
yeah, and they went back to Baltimore.
Yeah,
because
yeah.
there was family there.
Yeah, yeah.
So I wanted to know if that makes any
It makes
sense.
absolute sense, and it's true. I mean, if it wasn't your grandparents, it was somebody else, but it was quite. It was not a unique case.
Okay, that's what
I mentioned basically in the 1880s the impulse to open the frontiers to let immigrants come in. Listen, these people were not saints, because at the same time they were inviting white immigrants, they were having their wars against the Indians, the indigenous population. You know, the same President Roca was a hero of the wars against the Indians. They were just as cruel there as they were here. So, but there were different times, you know. That was 1880, 1881. But the ideology was positivism. Auguste Comte in Europe, you know, was one of the leading thinkers along those lines, and basically was practical, being practical, to impulse to give an impulse to the economy, to make everybody live under better conditions, it will improve all the institutions. Now, in 1905, everybody could come into the United States. Only you were rejected only if you had eye sickness. What is it called? Glaucoma. Glaucoma, right? Trachoma. Thank you. Yeah, trachoma. And another much older uncle of mine. He could have been age-wise my grandfather, but he came in the 1890s, a 14-year-old with 3 friends from Aleppo, Syria. And they went first to Marseille, you know, the children, you know. That's how, you know, people matured faster in those days. They left the home, and very bright, but very little education at the time, but they went to make America. And they were going to New York, but in Marseille, somebody told one of the 4, you have trachoma. You can't go. So they took another ship to Buenos Aires. Started selling oranges in the streets and whatever. You know, Quentinics. You know, you heard the expression Quentinics, the people who took merchandise on their shoulders and went from house to house to sell it. A lot of Jews did that. And they would say, you can pay in installments. It's 10 pesos, I'll come for 10 weeks, I'll collect a peso every week. And here's your cuenta, here's your bill. So they were called Quentinics, with a Yiddish suffix. And this was what they did. And this man, my uncle, did very well. He founded an industry and so on. It was a land of opportunity. But in the United States, and many went from Argentina to the U.S., even from the gauchos, you know, the colonies of Baron Hirsch, some went to the U.S. Many went to Cuba also because of, in the 1920s, when the quotas were established in the U.S. And the quotas, as you well know, it's well studied, the quotas had an objective, and the objective was to increase the immigration from the northern countries and decrease them from the southern European countries and East European countries in this country. Because the quotas for England or Switzerland or Germany were huge, but for Russia and Spain and Italy, they were very, very low. And that was the story. So when the quota was filled, no more Jews or no more Russians and Poles could enter the country, so they went to South America. A few went to Mexico and Cuba in order to come into the U.S. at the first opportunity, legally, or sometimes illegally, you know. And others went to Argentina, but most of those who went to Argentina went to settle. Very few went there and then went to somewhere else. By the way, to fill some gaps in the immigration picture, Argentina also took an amount of immigrants during the 30s and 40s. Every country had an excuse to close the doors. It was the Depression. You bring in immigrants, they'll take the few jobs that are open for the locals. Today, I'm not an economist, but I can understand the concept. If more immigrants come, you have to create more apartments, so there's more building, you have to and more stores. You know, you sort of, immigrants develop the economy. Not only do they take the jobs from the locals, but they create jobs as well.
Okay.
Anyway, the world didn't understand that, and every country was closing their doors with few exceptions. They would let it trickle in. Argentina let its trickle, sometimes with bribes and so on. We all know that. But after the war, quite a few who had gone, say, to Bolivia or to Paraguay or to Ecuador, smaller countries, they found their way to the bigger communities. So there was an internal Latin American migration as well to Argentina, and that helped form the larger community that we had in 1960.
Can you talk a little about life in Argentina today for Jews?
Yeah, well, today there's both sides also. Some Jews are doing very well, and for those who have been there or read about it, Buenos Aires is a beautiful city. You know, it's the culture there, the nice avenues, the architecture, the nightlife, not only the tango but everything. It's a very appealing city, but there's also a lot of crime, and there's the drug deals. You know, just I live in the Chicago area, so we have that problem too. With all the beauty of the city, you have the other side, the bad side. There's a lot of crime. I go there, I have family there, of course, distant family a lot, but I have two sisters and their children and grandchildren, and a lot of cousins and so on, but I don't see them because, you know, we make a life elsewhere. Life can be good and bad at the same time. I talk with my sister, Max. She would say, "Oh, it's terrible here. What a country. They even lost the final." He reminded me, the final of the World Cup.
They lost to Ecuador the other day too.
Yeah. So it's a national tragedy. Now they're looking into rugby. But on the other hand, there is the good side of life there. This election, I don't know what's going to happen. The Jewish community is divided regarding the president, Mrs. Fernandez de Kirchner. She has two Jews in two vital positions in her cabinet, but they are disliked passionately by the bulk of the Jewish community. First of all, because Mr. Timmerman, who is, I would say he must be about 65, he's the son of Jacobo Timmerman, who was a journalist who, a generation and more ago, he wrote that famous book, A Prisoner Without a Name and a Cell Without a Number, about the plight of the people in the concentration camps and killing camps of the junta. So the father was a left-of-center Zionist Jew, you know, not really in the mainstream of the Jewish community, and a very aggressive type of personality. But as he had himself, you know, after the big star of Elie Wiesel started to decay, then Timmerman became a hero of American Jewry. So in the 1980s, he was speaking all over the country because he was acclaimed as a hero, until he wrote a book decrying the Israelis, you know. And then Mayor Koch in New York when he attempted to move to New York, said, "We don't want him in New York. He'll write a book against us." But anyway, now his son, after the junta fell from power and democracy was restored, the Timmerman went back after being saved by Jews and the state of Israel and gone to Israel with his children. They came back and his properties were restored. He became a wealthy man. But the son Hector, he's married to a very, very wealthy family. And he studied politics at the Hebrew University, with also along the lines of his father, left of center, though he lives like a prince, and came back to Argentina and was dabbling in journalism and TV, etc. Then went into politics, became an ambassador in different countries, eventually ambassador in Washington in previous regimes after the fall of the junta. And now when Mrs. Kirchner took over, he became the foreign minister. Now, I didn't speak about this, but there were two big incidents in the 90s in Argentina during the government of Mr. Menem, who is the same party as the Kirchners are, the so-called Peronist party. And one bomb destroyed the Israeli embassy in 1992. 2 years later, another bigger bomb destroyed the Amia building, which is the main edifice in the Jewish community there, the Jewish Federation building, a huge place. I had done my research in the archives there years before, and but it was a symbol of the Jewish community. Close to 100 people died. It was the worst terrorist attack in the Americas until the Twin Towers. It was proven beyond anybody's doubt that there was a foreign agency there, and it involved the Iranian government and Hezbollah. It was not an attack against the Jews of Argentina. It was mainly an attack against Israel in a very around the way. And 20 some years later, there's no justice in the country, and it's very involved. There's a little bit in the exhibition at the museum about this, very little bit. There is no resolution, but everybody is aware, including the government, that there is an Iranian factor in those two bombings. There's no doubt, though officially it's not resolved. Now, about 2-3 years ago, or 2.5 years ago, the Secretary of the Foreign Minister, Mr. Timmerman, went and consulted with Iranian counterparts, and they established a memorandum of understanding between the two countries regarding the issues. And it was a scandal around the world, and especially in Argentina. The purpose was to restore economic exchange between the two countries. So for the sake of money, you forget what happened. The families of those people who lost their lives were up in arms. The Jewish community, the Argentine community in general, was up in arms. And they denied all type of involvement. You know, it was Timmerman was repudiated by and large by the Jewish community. Everybody has his or her defenders. You know, there are people who will take his side, but the mainstream position in the Jewish community is against him. And so there is, even in the words of the Mrs. Presidenta, you know, with the loans, you know, the bonds that were issued to the Argentine government, it's very complicated. I don't understand the details, but I understand the issue. The main issue is that the Argentine government doesn't want to default, but doesn't want to pay the interest or whatever it is due. All the courts in New York and in Washington have said you have to pay. So they call this, in Argentina, they call it los bonos buitres. Buitres are like falcons, you know, like these people are there grasping our money and destroying us. And the president of Argentina used a euphemism that they are like Shylock.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, amevin yavin is a Hebrew expression. It doesn't take much knowledge to understand. So, anyway.
They'll never resolve the death of Nisman.
Well, they never resolved the Amia bombings either. And he was the one who, I remember watching the news. You know, I read the newspapers in the internet, and they have these YouTubes of his speech the Friday before, the day before he was found dead. And he was so eloquent, so full of life. It was in January in Argentina. It's the summer, you know. And he was going to come on Monday morning, and he told the journalist interviewing him what he was going to say, denouncing the government, the president, the foreign minister, everybody. And Saturday night, he's dead the next day. The expression I told somebody else earlier today in Argentina is, you know, people want to say, well, he committed suicide. In Spanish, you say se suicidó. So then in Argentina, they say lo suicidaron. You know, they suicided him. I mean, we can laugh at it, but it's a pity that a relatively young man committed to what was his mission, to try to solve the issue and bring justice to the families and to the community, is now not there anymore. There are side issues. I mean, in the world, nobody is 100% clean, because they even discovered the bank accounts that his family has, his mother and his sister. I don't know, all types of dirt come. Who knows if they're planted or not? I read the news perhaps with a little more interest than many in this room, but I'm not an expert. I don't think anybody knows exactly what happened except a person who was there. And Nisman was there, and who knows who else was there, if anybody. Anyway, I tried to do a little bit of reminiscing, and we have time for one more question if you want to.
It's up to you.
I'm okay.
Okay. You need to, we should probably get out here by 4:30.
Okay. Are there any other questions?
Okay, thank you.